Being a couples therapist is a bit like being a detective sometimes, but instead of piecing together clues to solve a crime, I'm piecing together emotional bits of information to understand what's really going on between two people. Sometimes those clues come from how I'm being perceived by my client. And occasionally those clues come from how I'm feeling while my clients are talking. But what I'm always looking for are defense mechanisms in relationships. These are the ways we unconsciously protect ourselves from emotional discomfort. Now, these defense mechanisms can sometimes be major red flags or relationship warning signs. So if you've ever been given the silent treatment by a partner or a relative, that could be a defense at play. Or maybe you've laughed off something when deep down you know that it really hurt. That could also be a defense mechanism. At worst, they might be hurting you and your relationship without even knowing. And at the very least, they could be stopping you from working through problems and creating more emotional intimacy and connection between you and your partner. So spotting these defenses in ourselves, perhaps your partner, or if you're a therapist, your clients, can be the key to significant changes and understanding things at a deeper level. So I'm continuing my series on psychological defense mechanisms, and feel free to check out the other one, because we're diving into psychological defense mechanisms in relationships. I think they are so important. I've actually made a free PDF download you can get from my website. I'll put the link below. And if you're in a relationship and you're having a rough patch, you might want to check out my 7-day relationship rescue workbook. It's 50 pages of couples therapy activities and exercises. In my last video, I categorized defenses as being either primary or secondary. And that's not incorrect, because primary defenses refer to the defenses that come online when we're infants. They're all about getting rid of feelings. And secondary defenses are considered to be more mature defenses and appropriate for everyday living. But there's actually a different way of thinking about and categorizing defenses that's been developed along with the Defense Style Questionnaire, the DSQ. And it might be helpful to think of these as being on a spectrum, with maladaptive action defenses, image-distorting defenses, self-sacrificing defenses, and adaptive defenses being at the far end. So I'm going to talk more about some of the common defenses that I see in relationships in each of these 4 categories, what they look like, perhaps what they feel like, and most importantly, what they mean for relationships. And of course, along the way, I'll explain more, give examples, and help you understand what they're really doing on an individual level. So defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies we use to shield ourselves from anxiety, internal conflict, or overwhelming emotions. And let's face it, relationships bring up a lot of feelings because we attach to our partners, and that means that the stakes are so much higher when we are in love. So our defenses are bound to pop up with our significant others. So I'm going to take a quick second to ask you to please hit subscribe, share, comment, like if you're enjoying this content and want to know more. It just lets me know that I should keep making these videos. Leave me a comment if you want me to make specific videos at all. I love being able to make videos that answer your specific. I think of defenses as a buffer between our ego or conscious thinking and the things we'd rather not feel. For example, let's take Jimmy, a fictitious client who has just been told by his evil boss Simon that he has to go away for a last-minute work trip and he needs to leave right now that night. Jimmy feels a pit open up in his stomach, thinking about how he's going to tell his partner Jenny that he's got to go away and is actually going to miss her birthday. Now, Jimmy knows that Jenny is going to have some emotional reaction to this, and rightly so, poor old Jenny. He could completely forget to tell her that day. He could get swept up in meetings, giving presentations, get really distracted, go home, and then realize that he needs to tell her. That would be denial. He could tell her, and when she started talking about her feelings, he could tell her that his colleague's wife once got so mad at him that she deliberately washed all his white shirts with her new red jeans and sent him on a business trip with pink shirts to try and get her laughing. That would be using humor. Or he could tell her that he's just sick of her lack of support and always causing a fuss whenever he has to go on a business trip, and start a big fight by trying to make her feel guilty about her reaction. That would be projection, because he's putting his feelings of guilt onto her. Let's take a closer look at these 4 categories. maladaptive action defenses. These are at one end of the spectrum. It's a collection of immature defense mechanisms that involve acting out or doing something to get rid of the feeling. We're talking about impulsive behaviors or physical and mental strategies that might provide immediate relief, but often have really long-term consequences and are often damaging to a relationship. Image-distorting defenses warp how people see themselves, others, or situations. The goal here is to protect their self-esteem, their sense of self, manage anxiety, but it often results in this very distorted, often oversimplified view of the world that isn't quite accurate. Self-sacrificing defenses are defenses that involve putting others' needs ahead of your own. And I have to tell you, it's one of the most common things that I see in my therapy practice. I think that's partly due to the fact that we're raised not to be selfish. So it sounds nice or altruistic to put others first. But when it comes at an expense of yourself, it's a defense. Now, adaptive defenses at the far end of the spectrum are more mature defenses that don't completely get rid of feelings. Perhaps they modify them in such a way that they let us get on with day-to-day living. But still, they're problematic in relationships because they might prevent us from having access to the full range of feelings we have, and that can impact intimacy and closeness. So I want to make it really clear that we all use defenses to varying degrees at varying times, and probably resort to the more maladaptive ones when we're under stress, not feeling well, or have some overwhelming life circumstances. It's okay that we move up and down this spectrum. So that means that a healthy relationship is never free from either one of you using defenses, but unhealthy relationships have an over-reliance on the more primitive or basic defenses, and that can be very problematic. Let's start with some of the relationship red flags that come about from each of these categories. Some of the more mature or healthy defenses we use as adults are things like humor, suppression, identification, intellectualization. Even though they're more mature, they can be problematic when overused in a relationship, because when they become a go-to strategy in any person, they can create emotional distance in a relationship. For example, Jimmy might explain away the logical reasons he has to go on the trip. It's part of my job. This shouldn't be a surprise. I'm relied on to make money for the company, and I'm the breadwinner in this family. And we need the money to pay the mortgage. Now, these could all be totally valid reasons why he has to go on the trip and has to go away all the time. But in using this as a defense, he fails to connect emotionally with Jenny. Because let's face it, all Jenny really wants is to be understood, and for him to say, I know, honey, you must be so disappointed and sad, and I hate to leave you, especially on your birthday. So similarly, if one partner uses humor to deflect serious conversations by cracking jokes or trying to make their partner smile when they're upset, they're using this defensively to avoid having painful discussions about the emotional reality of the situation. We want to understand our partners and help them feel understood. It's a similar dynamic to the let's look on the bright side mentality that I see a lot of in my clients. Well, at least I've got a job, or at least we're not homeless. Again, these are all valid as true, but they fail to meet Jenny's feelings. So Jimmy might not be doing this on purpose because defenses are all unconscious. And as a therapist, I kind of have to point out the defenses to help him see how it might be damaging his relationship in the long term. Self-sacrificing defenses. Now, on the surface, self-sacrificing defenses might seem like noble qualities, constantly putting your partner's needs first or doing whatever it takes to make them happy. But when these defenses are overused, the person using them can totally lose themselves in the relationship. They might become so focused on making their partner happy that they neglect their own needs, and it often sets up a reciprocal relationship dynamic. So the more Jenny tries to put Jimmy's needs and wants above her own, the more he's going to let her do that. That means that Jenny has to do it more, and then we're in a cycle. So Jenny's constant self-sacrifice also means that she's expressing her own needs to keep the peace, but it comes at a really high cost. I tend to find that when there's unexpressed anger between two people, it creates emotional distance. You might make the argument that Jenny's being altruistic, right? Sacrificing her own feelings and needs to avoid an argument or to avoid putting more stress on Jimmy. and not wanting to make him feel guilty about having to go on a work trip. It is altruistic in some way. And it is also being used as a defense because she's avoiding the need to express herself and share her disappointment, anger, and hurt. So perhaps when he tells her that he's missing her birthday, she laughs and says, well, there's always next year, before she goes to help him pack his suitcase. There's actually a bunch of defenses being used there. Jenny might be completely unaware that she's angry or disappointed and has used humor to laugh it off, intellectualization to sort of justify things, and the interesting one that's self-sacrificing is reaction formation. She's turned her anger into the opposite feeling and is actually helping him by packing the suitcase. Image-distorting defenses. At this part of the spectrum, we've got image-distorting defenses, and we're getting into primitive defenses that are really quite volatile, sometimes disturbing, and it can feel like you are walking on eggshells in your relationship. You might remember in the introduction, I said that one of the clues I get from my clients is how I feel. Well, that's sometimes due to the defense that they are using, and in particular, I'm thinking about devaluing as a defense. So sometimes a client will say something, and it feels like I just got slimed. No, obviously they're not doing this on purpose, and it can be an innocent little comment like, oh, this is your office? Like, you chose to make it look this way. Or, by the way, that last one is absolutely not true. In fact, I think I undercharge, but it's a dig at me and how much I charge for my services. And the other example was devaluing of my taste or my office, which I happen to think is quite nice. So in relationships, this can happen too. Perhaps Jenny's reaction to Jimmy's last-minute business trip unleashes this defense in her, and she says something like, you care more about your job than you do me. What is wrong with you? Or perhaps Jimmy is the one devaluing Jenny and says something like, you are just so emotional and clingy. What's wrong with you? In Jenny's case, devaluing is pushing Jimmy away and covering up her anger or hurt. And in Jimmy's case, he's maybe feeling guilty about having to leave and making her feel bad. In both cases, those feelings are intolerable and they get kept at bay by these defenses. So the person using this defense distorts the other person to make them appear bad or weaker in the moment, usually to make them feel better. Splitting is a tendency to see the world as either all good or all bad. And I know this is happening to me when a client tells me I'm the best therapist they've ever worked with before we've actually sat down and done the introduction session. It kind of means to me that I've been put on a pedestal and I'm being seen as something more than I am. Now, don't get me wrong, it feels great, but there is a catch because what goes up must come down. And as much as I would love to think that I'm the Brené Brown of West Hollywood, I'm not. I have good days, I have bad days. I like to think I get things right more than I get things wrong, but I do get things wrong because I'm human. So whenever I get idealized, it's a red flag because it's one half of a split, and I know that there's probably going to be some devaluing in my very near future, and that feels like getting slimed. Splitting means someone sees the other person as all good or all bad, which is much easier for us psychologically to handle than that annoying ambivalence of realizing that someone you like has flaws. So what does that mean for relationships and dating? Well, let's just say, beware of love bombing. It feels amazing to be love bombed. And people using this as a defense will somehow sniff you out if you're likely to be impacted by love bombing in a big way. You'll be put on that pedestal, told that you are perfect, that you're the one, and it's often quite irresistible. It could be that you've met someone who legitimately thinks that way about you and really does idealize you in a very healthy way. If that is true, lock it down. But my word of warning would be just to listen out to see if there's any devaluing of other people. It might not necessarily be you. It could be a demeaning way they talk to a waiter at the restaurant, or they could be talking about someone at work like they're the worst human being on the planet. So this could be a sign that the person you're dating has a tendency to split. And right now, you're in the all good camp. It feels great. But you will inevitably make a mistake, say the wrong thing, not read their minds perfectly, and then you will be devalued and put into the all bad camp. And you'll feel like you just got slimed. So maladaptive defenses in relationships. When maladaptive action defenses are overused in a relationship, things can get really messy fast. These defenses are all about getting rid of feelings quickly in ways that might provide relief in the moment, but are often incredibly damaging to a relationship. So let's take acting out as an example. It's a defense where someone impulsively acts on a feeling to get rid of it rather than process it or soothe it, talk about it and express it verbally, like what us therapists try and get everyone to do. Kids act out all of the time. When mum or dad won't buy them that toy that they want, they can have a big old meltdown in the middle of Ralph's. They feel all kinds of things underneath that anger. They're disappointed, hurt, sad, but they're a kid, so they don't have the words to say that yet. They don't have the tools to regulate themselves or talk it out, so they get a pass from me for a meltdown in the middle of the supermarket. Adults who act out on their feelings are emotionally immature. They are using immature defenses. So this is a grown-up who is slamming doors, yelling, hitting things because they have a feeling. In my mind, it's pretty unacceptable, and they have to learn how to deal with their feelings in a more mature way. But it can be more subtle than that. So suppose Jenny and Jimmy have a big fight. Jimmy goes on his work trip and is having all kinds of feelings about leaving Jenny. So he gets to his hotel room and orders a bottle of vodka and gets absolutely wasted. He acted out on his feelings. What if Jenny feels horrible after that fight and is racked with guilt because Jimmy implied that her reaction was adding more stress to a really stressful last-minute trip anyway? Whose guilt is that? So we'll assume that Jenny's reaction was valid and she didn't throw pots and pans around the house, but just talked about feeling disappointed. How is it that she's the one that's ended up feeling guilty? So this could be a defense called projective identification. Jimmy is actually the one feeling guilty because he's leaving work at the last minute, missing the birthday. But he managed to get rid of that feeling and put it into Jenny. That's the projection part of projective identification. But if Jenny is the one thinking and feeling she did something wrong, she's identified with Jimmy's guilt and is assuming that it's hers. So he transferred his feeling to her. This happens pretty often in therapy sessions. A client will be talking about something and I might feel waves of intense feelings. Most recently, actually, I felt super sad in a session and I thought I was going to lose my shit and cry. But as I thought about what was going on, I realized that the client was talking about something quite sad, but they weren't showing their feelings about it. Instead, I think that they were putting their sadness into me and I was feeling it for them. So it let me know that they had a lot more grieving to do and there's a lot more sadness there that I had to process. The last defense I want to talk about in this category that I see a lot in couples therapy is passive aggressiveness. So I get a lot of passive aggressive comments in my social media. I made some short a few weeks ago about relationships and someone wrote something. So I went to reply and explain something, but they blocked me. It was a total hit and run. You can probably think of any bitchy mean comment on social media as slightly passive aggressive because they're technically not talking directly to me about their anger or frustration or whatever I've done to annoy them. And I do get that social media isn't set up for direct interactions like that, so it's not entirely on them. But if you're going to block me, then that really is passive aggressive. In relationships, it looks like stonewalling. It's the ultimate in passive-aggressive relationship behavior. Stonewalling is refusing to talk when you're angry or upset. It's the cold shoulder, it's the silent treatment. It's incredibly destructive to a relationship and very frustrating because it is blocking communication. It's a refusal to work through a problem and compromise or repair. Now, I fully encourage people to take a time out if they're angry or flooded, but that is different. Stonewalling is more of a deliberate shutting out of any helpful conversation to heal or soothe or repair. This defense is what John Gottman calls one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which means it's one of the 4 divorce predictors that we know to be true in relationships. So again, using defenses like this are really, really destructive to relationships. All right, so we're reaching the end, and I hope you realize that in relationships, it is really easy to fall back on these defense mechanisms without realizing how they're impacting you or your partner. And I hope you also get to see how they block talking about your feelings. So the key is really to become more aware of when we're using them or seeing what they're preventing us from expressing and to start talking about your feelings. So if you've noticed any of these patterns in your relationship, it might be time to have an honest conversation, maybe with a therapist, maybe with your partner. And if you want to learn more about defenses, remember that nifty PDF I created. It's got a bunch of defense mechanisms in and explanations, and also the 7-day relationship workbook. It's a 50-page PDF with some awesome couples therapy tools and skills that I've created. I hope again that you hit subscribe, like, or follow, and come back for more soon. So feel free to write me a comment and I will do my best to answer them either in a short or a long video. And again, just comments in general help me know that people are watching this.